To mask or unmask? This is often a serious question that many ADHD women entrepreneurs and ADHD women in general face, even if it is only subconsciously. And it's tricky because when we mask and communicate in neurotypical ways, we more easily avoid getting into quote unquote trouble or rejected with a massive RSD hangover. But then we may come across as inauthentic and feel like no one really gets us or knows us because they don't. And I won't pretend in this episode to have all of the answers here, and yet we'll share ideas on how to navigate what feels like complex social interactions with neurotypical folks. Be sure to listen. Welcome to the Self Loved ADHD Woman's Way podcast. I'm your host, Jen Barnes. If you're an ADHD woman entrepreneur, ADHD adjacent, or ADHD ish, you've come to the right place. We'll dive deep into the unique challenges you face, from the inner turmoil to the outer obstacles. We'll blend neuroscience, IFS, and somatic healing and explore practical strategies to help you navigate the world of entrepreneurship with ADHD with greater ease and effectiveness. I'm glad you're here. Hey, it's Jen. I'm so glad you're here. Masking. So today I want to talk about masking and conversation and just unpack that. And this is coming about because, first of all, over the years, both as a mental health professional, but as a coach now for ADHD women, and as an ADHD woman myself, I notice lots of challenges for us ADHDers when we unmask, especially in the presence of neurotypical folks. So I want to talk a little bit about how we got here. And before I dig into that, when I say neurotypical, I mean people who aren't neurodivergent. Neurodivergent means autistic, ADHD. It can mean complex trauma. It can mean PTSD. It can mean bipolar. It can mean a lot of things. But neurotypical folks are just communicating the way they know how, and they perceive things based on their neurotypical lens and are not, most of them, yet aware that ADHD folks, autistic folks, other neurodivergent folks might communicate differently than them. And so they may not give us the grace that we give them by trying to always learn how to communicate like them through masking. And some of that is because we've been masking this whole time. So how would they know? And at the same time, we've been masking because it wasn't always safe for us to not mask. So this is actually a pretty complex issue because on the one hand, if we want neurotypical folks to know how to interact with us and be able to accept our form of communication, we have to feel safe enough to share said communication. And because we tend to be highly sensitive people and our brains tend to be sticky, so we hold on to stuff and ruminate, this can be a challenge. So I want to get into this today. So recently, I've had a personal experience and I've had a lot of people in both businesses coming in and talking about times when they were triggered because they unmasked and it did not go well for them. And a lot of us ADHD women have a long list of these experiences, at least if you're anything like me, because first of all, we tend to be highly sensitive. Second of all, we're just communicating how our brains know to communicate. But then when we do that, because it's differently than neurotypical folks are used to, a lot of times they can get reactive with us or they get their feelings hurt. Not to mention we get ours hurt when they say things. But anyway, or in some way strike out against us when they're not seeing our heart. And maybe there's a chance we're not seeing theirs either. And so I do want to speak to that. But because of the stickiness of our brains, we tend to ruminate and hold on to things for not just years, but decades. I was talking to someone today who was saying that she remembers stuff that was said to her or that she said to someone in second grade that she still feels bad about. And this person probably has no idea. I remember things from that timeline too. And all throughout my life where I said something unmasked, not knowing I was unmasking, I wasn't doing it consciously. And ended up getting in trouble, whether that was using the word colleagues to describe the people I was in graduate school with. Apparently, that was offensive to my neurotypical coworkers at one point, or trying to directly address a bullying problem when I was a school social worker. I have a laundry list of times when I would get in trouble for speaking directly and saying things more of an ADHD way. And I suspect I'm not alone. You probably also have a list of those times, unless you were better at masking than me. Like, good on you. I don't know. But I really want to unpack this because I look at this and at 51, I got to tell you, I am tired of masking. I'm tired of masking because here's what happens. We mask so that we can get along with people and stay out of trouble. I'm using air quotes if you can't see me, if I'm not on a reel. But we do that, and then we get along with people, but people might not experience us as authentic, or we might feel like no one really knows us. And that's probably because they don't, because we aren't unmasking. And for sure, I'm not suggesting we should just unmask all the time in all settings because we do tend to have, I should say, not all ADHDers, but a lot of us tend to have sensitive souls, sensitive hearts, and like I said, sticky brains. So we tend to ruminate once our feelings are hurt. Not to mention, we tend to feel things very deeply. And a lot of times, what happens now will trigger all those times in the past. This actually happened to me just this past weekend. I was trying to share something a little playfully, and someone labeled me for what I was saying. But if they had listened to what I was saying, I was actually doing the opposite of the label they were saying. And it seemed like most people in the room understood it, but this person didn't, and then was very reactive and struck out at me, and I fell apart because it triggered all of the times I thought I was safe to unmask and then found out it wasn't. And I want to talk a little bit about how I handled this and what we can do. I want to share my experience of what I did as an ADHD success coach and also in my other business as a therapist, mental health professional for 25 years, because a lot of times we don't know. This isn't something we were taught. But first, I want to speak to something before we get into that. Part of the tricky thing about all of this is when we are unmasked, we can end up at the butt end of someone's sensitivity and they might be reactive to us and then lash out against us and shame us. That was my experience this time, and it certainly has been my experience in the past. Even when we're well meaning, people aren't seeing our heart, they're not seeing the compassion in what we're saying. And we might even be bullied or even reprimanded at work. I know that's happened a couple times to me, possibly to you. And like I said, if you're truly unmasking in this way, I suspect that this has happened to you too. And I want to be real honest because the hard part for me is this pushes my fair button. I have a strong fair button. My mom was super fair to the point where, like, when my sister graduated from college, they gave her the car that we owned at the time, which wasn't fantastic. It was an '89 Nissan Sentra that was not great. And this was in like 1998. But they gave that her to her as part of her graduation present, but I didn't get anything like that. So they looked up the blue book value and paid me that. Now, years later, she learned of that and was upset she didn't get the money, which, hey, totally valid to my sister. But that's how into fair my mom was. And so I have this huge fair button. And to me, it feels really unfair that the only way that is supposedly acceptable to communicate in our society is the neurotypical way. It feels really ableist to me. And it's like, oh, yeah, sure. I know how to accommodate neurotypical communication because I've been doing it my whole life, but I'm tired. And I suspect you are too. And the reality is, while it's not fair, a lot of neurotypical people don't know. They don't know that we communicate differently because we're not talking about it. They don't know because we've masked, because we've been hurt so many times before that we tend to mask with most people, except hopefully your inner circle. I'm grateful to have a nice inner circle of a few very close friends with whom I can show up unmasked, and they're either neurodivergent themselves, or they're therapists or yoga teachers. So there's that. Like, it's a pretty accepting, compassionate group who truly love and accept me as I am. And generally speaking, not a lot of neurotypical folks have experienced neurodivergent communication and learn to understand that's just how we communicate. It doesn't mean we're bad. It doesn't mean we don't like them, but that we've been accommodating their need for communication. We've been accommodating their sensitivity to our directness. And so that's okay. We can choose to do that. And there's an opportunity for some growth here. I suspect this will take time because this is a pretty new issue. I think a lot of, if you're neurotypical and you're listening to this, you might even be like, what the hell are you even talking about? But if you've ever talked to anyone who's autistic or ADHD and you felt like they blurted something out or they interrupted you, that is, we communicate in more circular conversations. So when someone's talking, we'll be like, oh my gosh, yeah, me too. Not because we're trying to one up them, but because that's how we connect. It's just a different way of communication. Neither one is better. But the problem I have is when neurodivergent communication is not allowed and we get in trouble for it. And I suspect we're a long ways away from that changing, especially in workplaces. But I want to talk about small ways that we can start to show up more authentically, even with our neurotypical folks. Because, like I said, at 51, I'm tired. I just want to be myself. And I'm done with people who can't take that. And it's not like I'm a raging asshole. Like, I'm not. I'm a super compassionate person and generally choose my words wisely. But I'm really tired of having to act like a therapist in every single interaction with someone who is not neurodivergent. It's exhausting. And I suspect you may be tired of it too. So then what do we do? Right? If you're like me, you've probably been told things like just grow a thicker skin or move on already or get over it. It wasn't about you, which seems to me to be more about the person saying it than actually helpful advice and actually seeing us in our pain of the situation. And so while I won't pretend to have all of the answers because I don't, what I'm about to share is what I've learned from my personal experiences and also professional experiences over the past 25 years of helping people with ADHD navigate this. And before I get into that too much, one thing I want to say, parts of me regret having masked so much, especially once I had my college degree. I understand to get through school relatively unscathed. I mean, kind of, not socially unscathed, but relatively academically unscathed. I certainly needed some of this masking there. I have no doubt that's true. And there was a point where I could have stopped masking, but I didn't. I chose to keep the peace. I'm not saying keeping the peace is wrong. I'm not saying there aren't times and places for it. And it's not always the best thing to do because then we lose touch with who we are. We lose touch with who we are and our own voice, and we start to get scared to speak our own truth in our own way. And perhaps that is inadvertently what well-meaning neurotypical folks are trying to do because they're uncomfortable and they want us to stop. Because it's just like, oh my gosh, you're awkward, you're interrupting, you're rude, even though that's not how other neurodivergent people would experience us. So I just want to speak to, I try to never regret anything. I have only one thing I regret, and that's that the last time I saw my mom, I didn't know it would be the last time I saw her. I wish I would have hugged the hell out of her even more than I did. I wish I would have breathed her in longer. That's my only thing I've let myself regret in my life because everything else is learning. And if I were going to talk to someone in their 20s, it might be a different conversation as to whether or not I would recommend masking to that same degree, right? It's like, yeah, it helps you get through society, but to what end? To what end? So here is the things that I've learned around unmasking and masking as a neurodivergent person. First, I want to say we always have a choice. And in order to make an informed choice, and yes, I'm not saying it's fair that we have to think about it this way, but if we want to not be on the butt end of someone's reactivity or getting us in trouble or whatever, then we can choose to be more intentional around our interactions. And so we have a choice as to whether or not we mask. I think it sucks that we have to make it, like I said, but we have a choice. And what I would consider is when you are choosing to unmask, number one, consider the environment in which you're in. Is it one that everyone will just pile on against you? Because that's a lot. Like, and maybe you have the bandwidth for that. That's part two of this choice, right? Is considering how many spoons or how much bandwidth you have for tolerating this. But also, you might consider, okay, are there any support people here or people who get me who would have my back? Is this a safe enough group or a safe enough person to unmask with? And do I have the bandwidth right now, the spoons, however you want to say it, to deal with any kind of fallout that would come? Had I thought this through last weekend when this thing happened, I would have been like, "No, I absolutely do not have the bandwidth for this right now. I've got way too much going on, not to mention dealing with as a social worker who believes in human rights and social justice, what's going on in our country, the United States, is really hard for me right now, and I do not have the bandwidth to deal with someone else's reactivity right now." So, had I known that community that I thought was safe was less safe than I thought, I absolutely would have masked more. So when we know, we can make an informed choice based on how much energy we have. I'm not saying we always have like, oh, tons of energy to deal with shit that comes up, but sometimes we have more than others. And right now, I just don't. I just don't have the bandwidth. So thinking about that before we decide to unmask. Number two, in making that choice, it's essential to consider what kind of relationship do you want with this person or this group of people? If you want a super authentic one where you feel seen and understood, then that's going to mean unmasking it, maybe gradually over time, but eventually being able to be mostly unmasked. Because when we're masked, people aren't seeing us. They're seeing our prepared words. They're seeing for me, I tend to navigate the world in my therapist energy and my therapist tone, even when I'm not working with people, because that's how I get by not getting in this much trouble with my ADHD. And it's exhausting and I'm really tired of it. So I personally don't want to be in groups where I have to do that. If I am going to be in a group where I have to do that, then I get to consider how much I really want to engage in that. And is it possible to be part of a group and maybe just not connect with some of the people who aren't as accepting? Because they get to not be accepting. I'm not saying they're bad people. They don't have to feel shame, but it's just they're not my people. And that's okay. Clearly not theirs. So that's okay too. So as you're deciding whether to mask or not, it's important to understand or reflect on what you want from that relationship. My 4 closest friends, I need to be able to be completely unmasked around them, 100%, because I want to be seen. I want them to see me for who I am. I want them to experience me authentically, and I want them to be able to do the same thing. So it's a relationship, and those are people who can have courageous conversations that are curious and compassionate when things do get said by one or the other that is misunderstood or understood a certain way. And that's the beauty of those close relationships and why those people and I have chosen each other, I believe at least part of. Some of it was damn luck. I'll tell you what, one of the best people I know in the world is my freshman year college roommate. And that was just like by lottery up at University of Minnesota Duluth. So there's that. But we've chosen to stay friends over time because of the connection that we have. And I'm forever grateful for that. So, all right. One of the things we need to do if we're going to choose to unmask is learn how to work with big feelings because with ADHD, a lot of us tend to be highly sensitive. We tend to feel things very deeply. And like I said, because our brains are sticky, it tends to stick in our brain and we ruminate and circle about it, possibly for decades, even if not constantly. So, one piece that's really important is to learn how to work with feelings. Number one, we've got to know or figure out how to regulate our nervous systems. And by the way, I wasn't planning on mentioning this, but while I'm talking about nervous systems, every month I've been doing a 28-day challenge. I just started in January to regulate your nervous system. I've made it a really low cost option as a way to work with me. And it's easy, like it's small and easy. And I've specifically made it simple and easy so you can get a result with as little effort as possible. It takes a little bit of time, but not a ton of time each week for 4 weeks. So I'll put that in the show notes. The next one starts in March. So if that interests you, you can certainly get going. If you ever go to that page and you aren't able to sign up, then usually there's a pop-up that'll come up that's for a priority notification list. You can always choose that. Okay, so being able to regulate our nervous system is essential because if we're dysregulated, we're not going to be able to work with the big feelings. It's like too much. And alongside of that, and these three things I'm going to mention about working with big feelings kind of go together, is being able to work with the feelings themselves, the parts of us that hold the feelings. So what does this look like? For me that day, it was like, okay, there's a part of me that feels this. There's a part of me that's really triggered because of this and this. There's a part of me that hates this person. There's a part of me that feels shame for hating someone because they weren't trying to be mean. Right. And so it's like understanding all the many parts that come up. And if you're like me, you probably have a gazillion of them because we think fast. Our brains go fast and everything is just triggering other stuff in those moments. And so finding a way to be able to work with those parts, for me, I use journaling, but I'm also trained in IFS so I can walk myself through that. So finding an IFS coach, that's something I offer in my program. If you want IFS coaching, I offer that for ADHD women entrepreneurs who decide to be in my program. So that's sometimes an option, but there's therapists who are trained in IFS. And so there's a way to do some of that work with parts, whether it's writing or just even acknowledging and validating for yourself. Then support. When that happened, I had unexpectedly two people who were very supportive in that moment. It was amazing. And they just asked how I was, and I was honest that I wasn't doing well. And they both held space for me and supported me. And that felt amazing. And then later I got support from a third person, and that was awesome. And so having support to also go through things, and when I say support, I probably mean with someone who is either a highly compassionate, neurotypical person who is accepting you as you are and understands your heart, or most likely a neurodivergent person, because those are the people who are going to be able to give you what you need when you're in that sensitive spot. And I'm not saying in any way that neurotypical people aren't supportive. I'm not saying neurotypical people can't be supportive to neurodivergent people. I'm just saying when we're in that really sensitive place where we just, that rejection sensitive dysphoria is heightened and we just feel like no one cares about us, the last thing we need is a support person to be like, yeah, you were kind of an asshole, even if we weren't, right? Even if most people would agree we weren't. So support from the right people is essential. Then it's important that you find at least a few people that are in your inner circle. These are your inner circle friends who are either also neurodivergent or also neurodivergent friendly. And they are okay with you unmasked. They are able to set boundaries. Like if you're info dumping, they're able to be like, okay. And they do it in a way that's kind or playful, even not shaming. It's essential that you have those people so that somewhere in your life you can be unmasked, besides just sitting in your house by yourself. Maybe that's why I like to live alone. Maybe. There's no maybe there. So finding those people that can do that and that are interested in developing a relationship with you and with whom you are interested in developing a relationship. I'm not suggesting that we should just be messy all the time, and expect other people to constantly care for us. we give back too, but also, to me, us communicating in our natural way shouldn't be thought of as being messy or terrible or shameful. And if you're around people who think it is, they might be the wrong people. I'm just saying. I had someone who I thought was a really close friend, and I could never unmask around her, and she really struggled with me and was always about to reject me, and I knew it. And it took me a while to realize, oh, I just can't be myself around her because it's not safe. So it was like, oh, okay, this actually isn't a friend at all. This person doesn't even know me. And so sometimes we have to make that decision on who we want in our inner circle. But it is essential to create an inner circle and remember that you control the drawbridge. You get to decide who can cross your moat, so to speak, who gets to be on your island when you want them to be on your island. That is up to you. Everyone gets to decide that. I'm not just saying neurodivergent people only get to decide that, but we all get to decide that. And because so many of us have gotten in trouble or shamed for the way that we show up in the world over and over again, and it tends to be neurotypical people who do that, not because they're trying to be jerks again, they probably, a lot of them think they're helping us function in the world, even though they don't recognize that the way we are is also essential to the world, that it's not bad or wrong, it's just different. So you control your drawbridge. You also control how much you want to have this conversation with people, that how you talk isn't bad. I'm not suggesting if you're calling people names and you're shaming people and you're belittling people, yeah, that's not neurodivergent conversation. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how we can be direct. Sometimes I'll share something by sharing an example or a story, and it takes me a little while to get to the point. So then people only hear the first part and then react to that. They cling on to it. And it's like, no, you didn't listen to the rest because it just takes me a little while to articulate unless I have a plan, right? When I do my podcast, I have a written out plan with notes. So I stay on the rails. That's why we have notes. Like a lot of us, we know what we're talking about, but we need notes to stay on the rails. And that's what I'm able to do on the podcast most of the time. Sometimes I go off the rails. But generally speaking, in regular conversation, we don't have notes. So sometimes when we speak off the cuff, the way we explain something our heart behind it may not be understood by people who communicate differently. And you get to decide how much you want to educate people, because nothing's going to change unless people know. So hopefully this gave you some choices for what to do in these situations, as well as just validated the hell out of you for these experiences. Because not a lot of people talk about this, but this shit is painful. It's so painful because it sticks with us forever. I remember all the little nasty comments people made in response to me just being my neurodivergent self. And I wish I could forget them. I wish I could. And some people might be like, well, that's trauma, Jen. We remember trauma clearly. I've resolved that trauma over and over again. When I think about it, it doesn't necessarily trigger me in the sense I experience distress. I just remember it happening and it not being positive. And it's what a waste of brain space. So, because it's not serving me, because in those circumstances, when I look at it from the neurodivergent lens, I didn't do anything wrong. And probably you didn't either. So hopefully you found some validation and compassion for your neurodivergence in this conversation, your neurodivergent way of communicating. Hopefully you learned some ways or you're taking away some ways to deal with the big feelings and to choose how you want to interact, because the fact of the matter is you have a choice. If you liked this episode or you've been watching a while but haven't yet subscribed or followed, please follow and make sure you leave a comment. I would love for you to leave a comment. Any kind of interaction in that way helps get my podcast out to more people. And so then I can help more people through this free option of my podcast. So I truly, when I say I would love it if you left a review, I actually mean I would love it. For real, because I want to help as many people as possible. And you leaving a review and sharing for others what this feels like for you is really helpful to me, but also to other neurodivergent folks. So, especially ADHD women. All right, y'all, take care. I'll catch you next time.